event, should I always say. It's go time. We ready to rumble?
Do it.
Okay. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to 1455's author series. We were never away, but we had a little event in July, about 76 of them to be precise, one of which featured the gentleman I'm going to speak to tonight. So we are just keeping that particular dialogue going, which I'm thrilled about. But if this is your first time checking out 1455 and the Potter's House collaboration, welcome. I am delighted to have you here. I'm Sean Murphy. I'm the executive director at 1455. That is not the focus of tonight. I will just say in brief, we are a nonprofit and we are obsessed with storytelling and celebrating storytellers. You can find out a ton of information at 1455litarts.org. This event tonight will be recorded. We will put that on our YouTube page, and I will flood the social media zone with information and links. So just lean back and enjoy the ride, which I will tee up just by saying I've been looking forward to this for a long time since I got a copy of this book, which we're going to discuss tonight. But before we jump into an explanation of the book, our discussion, and introducing our special guest, I want to welcome my partner in crime, Lee, who always joins us for these events. These author events, which stream live, are in partnership with DC's historic Potter's House. I have, on occasion, had the privilege of explaining their mission, but boy, is it much more preferable to let the master herself do that. So Lee, thank you for being here as always, and please take your time and talk a little bit about the amazing work that you and your team do at the Potter's House.
Oh, Sean, thank you so much, my friend. It is so good to be here. Always a joy to hang out with you and with 1455. This is a partnership that we value so much. My name is Lee Tivell, everyone. Thanks for joining tonight. I am the executive director at the Potter's House in the Adams Morgan neighborhood of Washington, D.C. We love this partnership with 1455, and we are so thrilled to have Dax-Devlon Ross with us tonight. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview for those of you who don't know us already, that the Potter's House is a nonprofit social enterprise. We are a bookstore, a cafe, and an event space, and we have been offering radical hospitality in Adams Morgan since 1960. We are a place, I like to say, where people cross paths who might never have crossed paths otherwise, and we are a place whose mission is really around welcome for everyone. I would encourage all of you to come by if you're in the Adams Morgan neighborhood. We're open for book browsing and for takeout every day. And during these hours, we also offer a free warm meal and a cup of coffee to anybody who needs it. No questions asked. So if you or somebody you know might be in need of a meal, please send them our way. You can learn lots more about us on our website at pottershousedc.org. I certainly encourage you to sign up for our newsletter and to follow us on social media, again, at Potter's House DC, so that you can stay in the loop about our events. But, all of that being said, I have to say, conversations with people like Dax, this is one of the best and most important things that we get to do as a small, independent social justice bookstore. And I have to say, I'm especially thrilled, Dax, to be in your orbit this evening because, part of our mission at the Potter's House is to be a place where we can have the conversations, the honest conversations, the sometimes uncomfortable or painful, but utterly necessary conversations that lead to transformation. And in my mind, letters to my white male friends is exactly the kind of catalyst that is called for to kind of spark that reckoning. I do want to encourage you, if you have not read this book, which we could not keep on our shelves, by the way, it flies off the shelves. There you go. Thank you, Sean. You can purchase it online from our bookshop.org storefront. I will drop that link into the comments momentarily. But again, Sean and Dax, just thank you so much for including the Potter's House in this conversation tonight. It is really an honor and a joy to be with you.
Lee, it's our pleasure and honor. Looking forward, as we said before we came on the air, to just an ongoing partnership and many more conversations and many more engaging and occasionally uncomfortable but productive conversations, which is what we're all about. So
Yeah.
thank you
Well,
so much.
yeah, and Dax, now that I know that you're our neighbor, we will hope to see you pop by soon. Let me
I
know
was
when
going to
you're
come in
coming.
and sign some books. Just if you have any left. I mean, I don't know if you have, I was
I
going
will
to
let
come
you know
in
when
and
we get our next stock in.
I
I'll
will come
drop
in
you a
and I'll
line.
sign some books. Seriously, because I'd love to come down and do that.
We would be thrilled. We'd be thrilled. So
Love it.
I will drop off and let you all have this conversation and follow along on Facebook, but I will be listening eagerly to the chat tonight. Thank
All
you so
right,
much,
Lee.
y'all.
Thank you so much. We'll talk to
All
you
right.
soon.
Okay.
Okay, folks, without further ado, let me introduce this handsome gentleman who you're seeing pop into the screen. I will read his bio, and I will say that this is the short version because this is a very accomplished scholar and gentleman, literally. So Dax-Devlon Ross is the author of 5 books, and his journalism has been featured in Time Magazine, The Guardian, The New York Times, Virginia Quarterly Review, Washington Post Magazine, and other national publications. He won the National Association of Black Journalists Investigative Reporting Award for his coverage of jury exclusion in North Carolina, and is currently a Puffin Writing Fellow at Type Media Center. A New York City teaching fellow turned nonprofit executive, Dax is now principal at the social impact consultancies Dax-Dev and Third Settlements, both of which focus on designing disruptive strategies to generate equity in the workplaces and education spaces alike. Dax received his Juris Doctor from the GW University and currently resides in Washington, D.C. with his wife, and at the time this bio was printed, daughter, but now it is his 2 children. So first of all, welcome, Dax. Thank you for being here. Secondly, congratulations on expanding your family since the last time we talked, and sincere gratitude for taking the time, because I know you're a very busy man of late.
Yeah. Well, listen, I mean, at this point, first of all, thank you, Sean. Thank you. It is really important that, that your audience understands how much work you put in behind the scenes, that you're a creative yourself, you're a poet, an amazing and accomplished poet, and yet you continue to find space and elevate writers. And that just says a whole lot, because sometimes us writers, we can get into our little world and we don't always open our eyes, look up and pull other people along and create space for others to have their work shared and shown. So I just want to give you some props for doing the work that you do, because it takes a lot to be both an artist and a creative person, and also someone who creates paths for other people so that they can have their work, exhibited for the world.
Well, I appreciate that. I'll acknowledge it, but I will just simply say that we were joking about cliches, as writers do, before we came on the air. And, sometimes you just can't avoid cliches, but I'm delighted to embody that hoary stereotype that says, if you love what you're doing, it's not work. And I being surrounded by creatives and trying to lift up conversation and storytelling is, if that's work, then that's work I'm happy to be doing. But I will say, I will continue to flatter you and say that it's a genuine honor, as Lee was saying. We need to have these conversations, and to be in the position of being able to facilitate a conversation like this about a book I'm going to hold up again, Letters to My White Male Friends. I mean, duh, right? It couldn't be more timely. It couldn't be more important. It's like this is plucked out of the newspaper. And I want to offer up a caveat to the audience. I'm just going to apologize in advance, because I think we would all agree this is a conversation that cannot be contained in 60 minutes, nor should it be. So I look at this as an opportunity to celebrate this achievement, have the opportunity to talk to the man who wrote it, and really kind of hammer at some high level key takeaways. But really, I hope the work we do tonight will suffice to inspire some people to understand that this is a work in progress that does require time and effort. So we will do it justice tonight, but I just want to acknowledge that there will be no mic drop, because we are not going to cover hardly any of the ground that we need to cover, but that's a good thing, I think.
Yeah. It's an ongoing conversation. It's ongoing work. So I second what you just said. Let's get into it.
Well, so let's, I mean, I think the best way, Dax, to start out, I mean, with any author, but especially an author of a nonfiction memoir that is by design topical is to say, was there a particular moment when you realized I need to write this book, or this book needs to be written. I'm the one that needs to write it. And now is the time it needs to be written. Because I know from knowing you and having read the book that this was certainly a work in progress. This is your life's work. But was there a moment when you said, you know what, a op-ed's not going to do it, a blog, even my professional work, this needs to be a documented effort that stimulates discussion? How did this come into life?
I mean, the short answer is my wife, Alana. You know, I think I was actually very reluctant to do that. I think you know, some people who might know or may not know that the book is an extension of a letter that was written. And, you know, one of the things that I was really thoughtful about is like, hey, you know, people read the letter, you don't need to overdo it, man. Come on, like, you don't need to, like, you know, pile it on. Like, and also, I'm just also mindful of just the idea of like how people capitalize on things that are maybe not that they're not meant to be capitalized upon, but they need to be thoughtfully and considerately engaged with in order to not just sort of reproduce some of the same things that we see happening. Like, I didn't want to just put another thing out in the world that would be, you know, and this is no disrespect to anyone else, but like just be more chatter in the space. You know, I've told people that, you know, I took 10 years off from writing books. Like, I didn't write a book between 2011, 2021. I was like 10 years of just living my life and, you know, writing some articles here and there, but trying to like just taking other work and doing other things and realizing that I wanted to do some growing before I went back to actually writing. And so I would say that it was even my talk to my agent originally. My agent was like, and I love my agent, one of my closest friends as well. And he was like, I don't know, man. Like, well, you know, we weren't initially sort of aware that there would be a market for something like this until we sent out the proposal. And there was like, boom, as soon as we sent the proposal out, there were meetings the next week and people wanted to hear. And I was like, oh, wow, okay, there's something here. I share that because it is important that it is recognized that this is an organic thing. You know, it wasn't like, I was like, okay, now, you know, it was much more of this is something that I feel like I can contribute because this is my experience, and my experience happens to line up in this way at this time in a way that maybe can be processed and understood and used to some purposeful end, you know?
Yeah. Well, you know, Dax, I'm glad you mentioned it in that way, because that actually is a topic that comes up repeatedly throughout this series, which is we're always encouraging writers, you know, be mindful of trends, try to understand the marketplace, know the business because it's a business. But man, if you're not writing from the heart and you're not writing something that you are invested in, how do you think it's going to resonate with an audience?
That's right.
How's it going to have staying power?
That's right. That's right.
But I also didn't say lightly, because it's, speaking of cliches, this is his life's work. And I don't want to reduce this book to that so much as to say, this is a continuum and it grew out of your personal lived experience, obviously, but also, you know, you've been having this dialogue with yourself and dialogue with others. I think the impetus for this came from this realization of, I need to specifically talk to, because I was going to kick off with that observation, right? Like, I think we can, for purposes of this evening's conversation and generally in terms of where we're at in 2021, there are the lost causes, pun intended, that we will work on. That's the long-term, you know, hearts and minds. But I think what's really powerful and important about this book is you're talking specifically to people that are at least on the playing field or willing to step their pinky toe onto the field. And I think from a very practical and pragmatic point of view, that's where you start, right? You know, it is going to be drowned out in the noise, in the intentionally cynical political, you know, discourse. You're trying to engage with people that are at least their ears are a little bit open.
Oh yeah, no, I think that, you know, I get asked this question, you know, why didn't you maybe turn the book into a title it, you know, To My White Friends? And I think, you know, honestly, that would have lost some of the real specificity and importance of the messaging that I wanted to convey. I mean, this is a book about power. This is a book about I use the word privilege, but I also think of it more around advantage. You know, this is a book around history And this is a book that's in many ways was directed to some of the closest people in my life. You know, it wasn't as if I was just writing to the wind. I was writing to people that I know. Each letter is probably somebody is actually was in my head, and they're a person who I care about, who's my friend, you know, whatever else have you. But I just think that we have this trouble in our country with having a direct conversation with white men about power and about and about like the fact of the matter being that if you look at Fortune 500 companies, if you look at our, you look at, seats of power across the government, you look at all sorts of things. And I mean, white men are still very much disproportionately represented in positions of authority in our society. That's the disproportionality thing that we're talking about. Not that there's not the case that we don't need, I'm not saying that we don't need white men, but I'm like, it is, if you're 65 to 70% or above that's not what your role, you're not that in society. So how is it that you show up in that way in so many different industries across our society, and we don't have a conversation about that and understand that there is a connection to our history. And it isn't to say that you didn't work hard. It isn't to say that you're not smart and capable, but it is to say that there are other people who are smart and capable, who do work hard, who do put in the work every day, who don't get the same opportunities. And if we can't talk about that, if we can't understand that that is part of the dynamic that exists in our society, then we're just not willing to we're not ready to be honest about that. And I think that that's why, for me, these are people I've grown up with and known all my life, and people I've worked in my life has intersected with in both personal and professional ways. And there have been times where I felt like I've actually shirked the conversation and avoided it, or watered it down, or or contorted myself to make my white friends comfortable, because I didn't want to actually say what really, was going on or how it really was. But I was like, this, because that gets too messy. That's just too much. And there's a whole lot of context I have to give. But then I realized actually I'm doing a disservice to our friendship, because if I say I really am your friend and we really are in relationship and not just acquaintances and passing in the night and just hanging out, then I need to actually commit to saying that I'm going to do something more and be open into the feedback that you have to give me too. Because this isn't a one-way conversation. It is the case that people have experiences that may challenge my narrative. And I own the fact that my narrative is a narrative that I try to steep in some objective truths. I try to use law. I try to use like the sort of things that are happening contextually to connect up to my experience. But I recognize that people still might have a different interpretation of the very things that I'm talking about. And that's valid, even if I might disagree with it, but we got to talk about it nevertheless.
For sure. And I think you ground the narrative, deliberately and very powerfully by kind of acknowledging your own epiphanies and how you've come to, you are not the prophet on the trail that saw the light and now is trying to convert people. You are sharing your lived experience and how this has come from decades of observation and experience and conversation. But I think what that does, Dax, like almost, implicitly, I think it's very explicit, but implicitly, it's making the reader understand everyone has to come and grapple with where they are and what they think they know, and just appreciate what they don't know. And then what your book does, among many other things, is take us through perception and even what the most amenable potential ally might be shocked to discover they've been fed a narrative that not only doesn't tell the whole story, but it has deliberately told a very privileged story. But it comes from the individual recognizing that. And I think by you acknowledging up front how this has been a journey for you, it invites the reader in. It invites the reader in to engage in a learning experience.
Yeah, I mean, you articulate accurately that there are elements of memoir in this, but I also, this book is 200 and some pages long, and it's in a small book form. It's intentionally lean, and there's for a couple of reasons for that. I think that this is the kind of story that that is more about depth than breadth. And I think it's really more important to be very intentional and thoughtful about the specific stories I told versus telling every story. I tell people, like, this isn't my life story. Like, I got a lot. I don't tell what my love life is not in here. You don't hear about I don't talk about a lot of things, but what I intended to do was talk about specific experiences that where race was on the table. And there was perceptions that I had or experiences that I had for the purpose of people using that, what I offer, to do their own work. If you notice, the whole book is full of questions. the book always, it uses the questioning, it uses that rhetorical questioning as a way to make folks know that this isn't a passive reading experience. And if you're just reading and turning the pages, and you're not really doing, then you don't need to read this book, because this is entirely intentioned for you to commit to some real stopping and pausing, looking up and wondering and thinking about, and then then go back into it. And so that's all very much by it was part of my design going into the process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things, we know we're in the hands of a natural and skilled storyteller, because we're talking about narrative and what the goals are, and how to effectively approach these topics, and questioning and engaging, as opposed to, the best compliment that I can pay this book is that I consider myself modestly and humbly, a fellow traveler, in the sense of I'm definitely, my heart and mind are in the right place, whether I've been effective or more, helpful than not. And I had continually had scales dropping from my eyes, because there just are things, however well-intentioned you are, we cannot know other people's lived experience. And I think what your book is helping add to the current discourse is, I think we're at a somewhat of a crossroads, where at least there's a lot of noise and there's a lot of resistance, but we are at a cultural moment where there's an opportunity for these voices to be heard. I could be accused of being too optimistic. What I love as a communicator and a writer is, are we able to have a discussion? Doesn't mean it's going to be a successful one, or even a productive one, but are we able to have this discussion? And now we're in a place where the culture is able to process this, where I think 20 years ago, it got shut down.
Without a doubt, I think there's a different level of literacy amongst a broader reach of the population around conversations. I mean, it was the case that, I remember 6-7 years ago running a workshop for a board, and I remember like the hesitation I even felt around using the word white supremacy. And I always remember, this is 2014, and I was like, wow, I found myself in 2014 uncomfortable in a very clearly white, in a very white dominant space, using that word, because I was concerned and worried about how white people were going to hear it. And I offer that because I've been socialized within the structure as well. And part of what I'm trying to get at is that none of us gets to escape the socialization that goes on here. It is very encompassing of our experience in many different ways. And whether we recognize it consciously or not, we can become very conditioned to be concerned about the feelings, emotions, and all the things going on for white people, and not want to make them white folks uncomfortable. And so while we might be having these conversations internally, but whether I think only in the last few years has been, and I credit a lot of young folks, to be quite honest. I credit a lot of, folks, whether it's Black Lives Matter, folks that have just become much more unapologetic, because, and that's why I think generationally is such an important conversation, because for me, who identifies as a Gen Xer, there wasn't a mainstream space for us to have this kind of discourse. In many ways, those of us who were developing a critical or race consciousness felt like we were in the margins constantly. Like, wasn't like for many of us, our coming of age years, there wasn't a space, meaning a social media platforms for us to be able to be in, to know, like, I'm not crazy. There are a bunch of other people who feel that way. So that is a really powerful and important feature of our society that has allowed for people to identify their tribe. I think that was always one of the most disruptive elements of past movements, was the ability to isolate people, the ability to cut off means of communication, so that I couldn't know what was really going on in other pockets of the country or other pockets of the world. And therefore I'm left feeling like there aren't people who are also mobilizing and trying to be a part of the resistance. You only find them when you go to some really, really fringe, a very radical event. Like, you got to go to this rally over here, you got to read this really obscure newspaper. Now it's much more part of the mainstream, which is a good and a bad thing, right? Because you have to be very clear about, like, how language gets easily co-opted, how ideology, how in a power structure such as ours that is so comfortable at co-opting ideas, co-opting people, co-opting movements, and using them and twisting them and watering them down, and then pushing them back out, so that they just become arms of of empire ultimately. So we have to be careful about what is the work we're trying to do, which is something I'm always in conversation with myself about. Like, yo, Dax, are you really about this work, or are you really about selling books? Like, which is your thing you're up to right now? You got to be clear about that and be honest about that.
Sure. Well, all right. So I want to start getting deep. I will start by saying, as a former grad student and, as a compulsive reader, I think one foolproof way you can measure engagement with a book is as the dog ears.
Yeah, man.
There's a lot of dog ears, some engagement's been going on, but I want to acknowledge, Dax, that there's not just dog ears, there's some elephant ears in this book. So there are some passages that I knew I needed to return to, and some passages I knew I was always going to return to. If I may, I'm going to read a couple of lines to you, which I think will be a good way to get inside your head. And also for those checking in, like, all right, guys, you're up here, which we need to start up here. Let's get into the belly of the beast.
Yeah.
There's an amazing moment where you're asked, I think this gets right to the heart of the matter, what you just set up beautifully. Thank you. You're asked, well, how do we undo systemic racial bias? And it's almost a rhetorical question. And you reply, you undo it by first acknowledging that the system is real and that you're a part of it.
Yeah. I mean, just a quick reaction to that. I think that rhetorical question is used as a way to not engage in work. I mean, I say that, like, you could, if you apply that question to any number of things in life, that does not become the reason not to do something because it's hard, or because you may in your lifetime might not see the outcome around it. But I think, I wrote the book, and I wrote it pretty furiously at the end of last summer, and I finished it actually the night of the election. And I wrote it knowing that that we were going to be at a point, whether it was going to be a year from now or 2 years from now, where there was going to be a real pushback against anything that we were experiencing. Like, this is just too, like, this is too easy. Like, people are too willing to agree right now. This is not going to, this window we're experiencing is not going to exist in this way. And sure enough, what we've experienced in the last, 8 to 9 months, has been considerable pushback against these things. We have 8 states now that have passed legislation that is designed to effectively ban a book like mine from being taught in a school. Now, you can probably find some ways to skirt it. You have another almost 20 states that are considering legislation that would ban the teaching of, considerate teaching of privilege, teaching of implicit bias, the teaching of sort of a history of the United States that is actually an accurate representation of the facts, that this is actually what's happening. And so what I was trying to be clear about is, let's not start with the, can we do it? Let's start with the question of, do you engage, do you accept and acknowledge that it is a real phenomenon, whether or not it is as pervasive as what some people make it out to be, whether it shows up in every single institution, and whether that's, put that aside, but can we engage with one another with an understanding, a shared recognition that this is not something that's being made up by Black people and some allies in order to get over on white people, in order to get ahead? Because I think that there's a narrative that is very pervasive in our culture that, that Black people in particular are always trying to find a way to get over, or trying to find a way to use race to their benefit. And there's so this trope exists in our society of Black people almost like crying wolf every time something happens. And you even have Black folks who will come out and say, well, that's not race. So we get into these ridiculous conversations like, that was racist, that wasn't racist. Was that racist? I don't know if that racist. And it fuels the perception that, it's not worth getting into because everything becomes possibly racist. So why bother even trying? And it also just sort of continues to lead people who are genuinely trying to understand how this thing called a system, where it doesn't require individual actors to be so consciously and willfully trying to oppress people, yet and still participating, continues to operate. Like, that's the conversation I think people want to have, the literacy people want to gain, the lens people want to develop. But until we can, really start to just settle for once and for all that it's real, and that it is not purely past tense, we're going to constantly feel like we have to legitimize and justify and explain. And I'm like, that's just tiring. That's just tiring, guys. Like, that's just not helpful. We're not getting anywhere by this level of denialism, and that's why I call it the culture of disbelief, in this chapter. It's like, there's an element of it, like, I have to say at a certain point, it's not just denialism. Disbelief to me is a different level. Disbelief is like a willful choice to not believe something that is actually happening right in front of you in real time. And I think people do it in many aspects of their lives. And in particular, I see it showing up around race conversations, particularly when someone feels like there's something that at stake that they might have to lose or give up or share. So therefore, the disbelief becomes a very powerful tool, especially when you can find other people to be disbelievers with you in maintaining a status quo.
Yeah. Wow, that's great stuff, Dax. I want to, perhaps a little bit selfishly, although it's in the service of the work you do, I just want to give you a virtual high five, because you touch on two things that are personal obsessions of mine. By the way, I want to qualify, this is about me, but just two things that I was so happy that you specifically addressed, because they've been things that have concerned me as it relates to the struggle and our inability collectively to move the ball further down the field. The first is making people understand the difference, both in terms of definition and application, of prejudice versus racism, which I'm shocked that has not been more firmly entrenched in our culture. Although cynically, I understand exactly why, because racism becomes this blanket that inoculates, like, well, I didn't use the N-word, so I'm not racist.
Yeah.
That, which I want you to pontificate on as you wish, but also what I've really been obsessed with, and you do some wonderful work articulating how the conservative cause has run circles around the liberals as it relates to narrative strategy, and owning the conversation, which impacts media and how history is taught, et cetera. But those are two things that I don't feel are addressed nearly often enough. So I was very relieved and inspired that you took those both head on, because I think our white friends need to understand both of those things a lot better.
Yeah, I mean, I think conservative ideology and narrative building has become more apparent because it's come out of the shadows. Whereas when I was growing up, I think it still kind of was able to present itself as part of sort of an objective kind of part, and it was able to present itself as almost innocuous, or as like a common sense, which was often a way that we hear. Common sense is a term that is often framed as a way to short circuit what we really have to do is hard, deep deconstructing. So common sense becomes a way to dismiss people who maybe want to engage in a deeper dialogue, who will get into some esoterics and want to talk about history. Like, but common sense says, let's talk practically. So that's a catch-all phrase. And I do think, if we just look at the ways in which, specifically the conservative agenda is operated, and I don't have the entire history of it, but I have studied it to the extent to understand the way it began to really manifest potently in the 80s and in the 1990s was largely through several foundations, small foundations, not I mean, they were large foundations, but they were foundations that were not that were focused on developing, nurturing, and disseminating ideology that would dismantle the civil rights. That would dismantle civil rights gains. I mean, that was very much the intention. So you start to see the creation of action groups called I'm paraphrasing the National Association for Civil Rights, but they're actually not about civil rights as we understand it. It's about civil rights that are really designed to present and to push a kind of narrative around color blindness that ultimately maintains a certain status quo. And I just think it's really valuable and important to begin to understand that while the liberal agenda has been very much about, addressing the ultimate, shrinking of government support around poverty programs and a variety of other programs that we know are necessary for a society to function. Whereas, I think the liberal establishment has stepped in to fill the gap through nonprofits, through a variety of NGOs, that are designed to really address these problems, at least maybe not root cause problems, but they're trying to address manifestations of problems. The liberal agenda has been like, cool, y'all go do that. Y'all try to save society. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to use far fewer dollars with much more effectiveness. So they've been able to get much more bang for their buck in terms of being able to move their agenda along. And I think we've seen that really in the last 10 months when it comes to this anti-critical race theory movement that has been very artfully orchestrated, and it's been clearly disseminated. There's clearly a playbook that's been disseminated through, to a small group of very influential people, and they're running with it. And it doesn't require nearly the kind of capital and investment that I think the sort of efforts albeit very important and necessary, that the liberal establishment gets caught up in, having to like do massive programs to address, education access, doing massive programs to deal with, incarceration and people returning home. Like, this is the shit we got to deal with over here.
That's right.
Because this isn't, we didn't create it, but we have to deal with it. And the conservative movement is able to say very, very sort of like, just sort of, remove any responsibility it might have to addressing these problems and really focus more on ideas. And ideas become their stock in trade, and it's very effective. It's very effective. And I say it's very effective because it taps into white grievance, because white grievance never really goes away. White grievance is just below the surface at all times, meaning there's this sense amongst not all white folks, but some white folks that there is an entitlement that is owed to them for a certain, to have a certain level of achievement and access in society relative to people of color, relative to people who it is assumed, even if it's not spoken, are less American. And when that gets challenged or that gets in some ways disrupted, white grievance becomes very, very, obviously aggressively present. So we see it in school districts, we see it in city council meetings, we see all these things popping up and like, oh, this is exactly what happens. This is how it happens, because that anger, that grievance has never really been resolved, and it's always been a part of our psychic psychology, our psychic history, And so, I try to tap into it and just give people a through line, at least as it relates to my history, my experience. Tracing back, I talk about, The Closing of the American Mind was a very important book, and it becomes a very important book because it permeates the culture and starts to be, present this idea that our higher education institutions have been hijacked by identity politics. And so that same trope continues to this day, but that's the genesis of it, at least as a mainstream construct. I called it a straw man. Wasn't really true, wasn't really real, but that is where you start to see it disseminated. And then a few years later, you see George H.W. Bush talking about political correctness. And so you notice that idea has gone into the highest office in our land. Now it begins to go spread like wildfire.
That's right. That's right. And I think, our aforementioned potential allies, I think where the rubber meets the road and we start to lose people is getting the acknowledgement that what you point out as the common sense or the status quo, getting people to understand, much less accept, that history happens. There's a narrative there, there's a privilege there, and there are people who have taught us what we think is the way it's always been. There's always an agenda. And I think that's where our white friends, and I'll include myself, right?
Yeah.
Our white friends start to get very uncomfortable acknowledging that racism is a system. There's a deliberate cause and effect. None of this happens by accident. And your point about when there have been, cultural moments and touchstones in reaction to civil rights, in reaction to critical race theory, these are very deliberate counterstrikes to regain the narrative and give people cover who would say, and I just saw this. I don't even want to get in. I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but I just saw the clip. It was Bill Maher, who, he to me epitomized the struggle when he said on a recent show, my grandfather didn't own slaves, so what do I need to apologize for? And it's like, way to completely exonerate not only yourself, which is a cowardly move, but let many white people off the hook, including someone like myself that could say, I'm Italian Irish. My people didn't come over here and own slaves. It's like, that's not the point. That is a misnomer. And that is a way to completely derail a productive conversation about history and what's happened and how systems are in place. And you get into this with like redlining and gentrification and the complicated history of all of these things that, taken from a different narrative, would say, we're rebuilding cities. Even something like that is not anything but innocuous. But getting people to accept, get outside of that is a huge challenge.
Right. Well, and it's also, you have to be giving folks like, what do you, I always feel like when you're asking people to give something up, what do you ask? You also need to provide them something that is going to be valuable and worthwhile for them to begin to attach themselves to. Like I think it's not necessarily fair to just say, here's the problem, walk away. You have to do some solutioning with people, some presenting to people of what might be the realities that would be better potentially even than the one that you're experiencing right now. And moreover, how can we communicate it in such a way that people don't feel like there's only, all they have to gain is loss. All they have to gain is a shrinking share of the pie. And I think it is and it's something that I still am trying to work out and figure out and kind of narrative build around, is that I think that it is true that people, white people who don't feel themselves as having come from, means and opportunity, they definitely feel like that those issues aren't given the same sort of cover. But what I try to pair that with it is that you are also not problematized in society. You are also not positioned as and scapegoated as the problem. It is not framed that you have to be eradicated, eliminated, or in some ways sequestered to parts of our society because your presence becomes a problem. That's where I think people get stuck, is that there is something that is connected to this pigmentation that it isn't just about like lack of, it is about, there are additional, not just additional hurdles, but there are additional sort of obstacles that I have to therefore navigate that have nothing to do with whether or not I want to work hard, I want to try, I care about that's not really the relevant conversation. And that's why I was very reluctant to write about my experiences with the criminal justice system, because in this weird way, this is how disturbing and perverse our society is. Like, I wrote about my experiences and I was like, I felt like almost, not that it was a shame in writing them, but I felt, how dare I write about my experiences in a jail cell when I know people who spent 20, 30, 40 years. But that's how perverse it is, where I try to find a way to normalize my experience or reduce the impact that experience had on me because of the extravagant level of violence and subjugation that we have become accustomed to in our society. So I almost find myself delegitimizing my experience as a Black person. Well, because I had some class privilege, or I delegitimize the experiences that I've had with the police. Well, I didn't get shot. Why should that shouldn't be the measure. Well, I didn't get shot. It didn't kill me, at least. So what do I have to complain? But that's how disturbing it is, because the larger landscape is such that is a norm that exists. We have in our society where getting shot, dying, being put in prison for 20, 30, 40 years is normal. Yes. It is a normal feature of life. And as a Black man, I come up believing, I remember at 21 years old, man, I mean, this sounds completely bizarre and twisted to think this way, but I remember waking up on my 21st birthday and thinking, wow, I just cleared a major hurdle, because I wasn't dead and I wasn't in a jail cell and I wasn't under police, I wasn't under law enforcement control. And here I am in college thinking this. Why would this be in my mind? Why would I have any sense in myself that my life should be in any way it should be an existential threat that I should have to think about at 20 years old, unless it was the case that I'm looking at and experiencing a life in which that is normalized, and no one seemed to care. No one seemed to think it was a problem until very recently.
Right. Well, and I think that brings one of our micro threads somewhat full circle when we were talking earlier about your lived experience and my observation that where I cling to optimism, or the potential for optimism, is when I say on a cultural level there is the possibility of a discussion. I think if there is any, and I won't even call it a silver lining because that's offensive, but through the exposure of this chronic and systemic issue with police and Black males, at least there's less resistance, because we can't deny what we're seeing on the TV screen. But you ask a rhetorical question to your white friends in the book that is extremely powerful and potent when you say, have you ever been afraid of being pulled over? Have you ever thought, if I get pulled over, I could die? And I think that cuts right to the core of any white person, no matter what they're doing. And again, that's another rabbit hole we don't need to go down, but serial killers or, mass murderers are apprehended and walked to the police car. So the evidence is there, but your ability and your willingness to ask in the book, I'm asking you to think about this. Yeah. Have you ever been afraid for your life in the police? And I think the reality, right, is most white people are like, no, because the cops are there to protect us. Exactly, right? There's a show don't tell moment if there ever was one, in terms of what is the lived experience of a Black male versus a white male. There's a lot of examples, but to me, in 2021, I think it's hard to find a more devastating example of the disparity right there.
Yeah, and I like where you're heading with that, and I want to kind of branch a little bit from one of the sections in the book where I talk about, and I asked another kind of question was like, have you ever observed Black pain or suffering and just turned away? You know, I talk about it through the lens of my experiences in college experience, where, you know, I can very clearly remember, you know, going to certain protests that were clearly about trying to get justice, and my white classmates just walking to class, like, you know, and just the level of indifference to this stuff, that becomes a conditioned behavior. So when you see Black people organizing themselves, you see people of color making sort of a stand around issues that are important to them right now, voting rights, right? Like, how are people mobilizing and engaging themselves around this voting rights issue? Because this is a serious issue. We're about to see a lot of folks disenfranchised. And it's like the disgusting irony of on a Friday, in our legislature, you know, on Friday, Congress votes to make Juneteenth a national holiday. And then just a couple of days later, they decide that they're going to block these same conservatives who voted for Juneteenth, meaning they're willing to give a symbolic day of work off work, sure, but they're not going to vote for and actually support substantively what that actually was about. What Juneteenth was actually about is about enfranchisement. So that's where you see the discourse. And so my question becomes, are you going to show up at that moment? Are you going to show up then? Do you, or is it just and I even ask, is it when you observe, you know, Black pain and suffering, do you find yourself annoyed? Do you find yourself wishing Black people would just get their stuff together? Do you find you wish that we would just stop, just get in line and do what we're supposed to do and figure it out and follow the rules? Do you find yourself going to that place of impatience, of a sense that, you know, we have done something to deserve whatever that treatment that we might be receiving actually is? And I can tell you, I've worked with some leaders and organizations, and whether or not they will articulate that level of contempt, it exists. That level of, you know, exasperation, like, oh, here we go. We have to have this conversation now. Right. You know, well, yeah, we do, because everybody I'm looking at around your table how is everybody at your table white people, white men? How is that possible? How is that possible? And we're not having a conversation about that. And you're exasperated because I bring it into the conversation. You're like, why do you got to make it about that? Well, I didn't make it about that, actually. Don't put that on me. I'm just asking you to ask the question, like, how did this happen? And you say this is a fair and equal process, you know?
Yeah.
If you can't answer that question legitimately without leaning on meritocracy, which we know is a problematic narrative in and of itself, then I think we have a problem here.
Well, so I'll give another specific example, Dax. You know, I mean, I learned a lot from your book. I knew I would, and I was ready for it. But one thing in particular I want to call out, and I think audience will appreciate, and hopefully will inspire some people to go to the source. But I learned a lot and appreciated your deconstruction of charity culture.
Yeah,
from the top down, and what goes on there, and the whole white savior, speaking of narrative and strategy and racism, and talk a little bit about you know, because I mean, again, you speak from experience on so many levels, but you in this section, you're talking about like specific conversations you've had, and it was infuriating.
This is a really hard chapter for me to write about charity culture. Like, so what I mean by charity culture is that, I mean, I just finished reading a book about sort of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, Unworthy Republic. It's an amazing book. And one of the things that becomes apparent is that the same Wall Street bankers that are capitalizing on the dispossession of Indian folks' land across the country, their wives are leading philanthropists. You know, they're setting up charities and having charity balls, and they're even part of the abolition movement. I'm like, so what I mean to say is that schism is a part of our narrative. The way we deal with racial capitalism is through charity. The way we deal with you know, injustice, the taking of people's land, the use of people for chattel, the sort of all sorts of things we have filled the gap with is this idea of we will create a charity to solve the problem. But moreover, that charity will then become a celebration of the very good white people who have decided to give back to society as a result of their largesse, much of which often, at least historically, had been developed and gained through the exploitation of people. And so therefore we have an entire, I don't call it a sector, it's not just an industry, a sector in our society that was set up in some sense, the 501c3 model, and I live it, I love it, it's a part of my work, but we have to be clear about it. 501c3s and the charities that support them were set up as tax evasion, as ways to deal with tax, wealth tax and being able to transfer wealth. I mean, that's one major feature of it. Another major feature is a recognition that many of the our industrial barons, whether it was Carnegie or Ford, whatever, they recognize that there needs to be some level below which people don't fall, or they would be an interruption to their business enterprise, right? They knew that, like Carnegie had people striking, that's where he had to call the Pinkertons in. And it's no irony that the Pinkertons, who were called in to be the ones to beat up folks that were striking, are now a charity in New York City. So now they are atoning for that past harm by giving money to underserved kids and communities and whatever else have you. And I don't think that that is necessarily the case, that we need to get rid of those things, but we need to give people more clarity about how those things came to be, what purpose they should be serving in society, who should be controlling them, what accountability those resources should have to the communities that they're derived from. Because let's be very clear as well, part of the reason we have such large charity infrastructures that we decided in the 1980s to lower taxes to such a paltry level that we had so much more wealth flowing into the hands of fewer and fewer people. So yeah, we could, Jeff Bezos gives $100 million to, Van Jones or whatever else. I'm like, but first of all, Jeff Bezos made that much money when he was up in space. He made that much money while he was up in space for whatever, 30 seconds or whatever it was.
Right.
And then secondly, he needs a buffer. And those buffers keeps the oil, keeps the change oiled, keeps the thing moving. And charity culture serves a very important purpose in allowing for a culture that exploits people, that marginalizes people, and obscures the real challenges that we have as a society to address our problems. And it places a really nice veneer over top of it, which is, people doing really wonderful things, making big gifts. And again, I'm not sitting here dissing people for doing it, but I think people need, even the folks that are doing it, need to be clear that there's a whole structure that we've set up as a society to support that narrative and to present that as the only solution to our problems, when we know that there are other solutions. They just would require us to give a little bit more money into the larger pot and distribute the resources a little bit differently. But people don't want to really do that. So we come up with charity.
Well, and that gets back to the notion of narrative and how how status quo is defined and maintained, and also how it really does allow the people that have skin in the game to not really do anything. Writing a check is one thing, putting a bumper sticker on your car is one thing, but actually fighting and taking action in whatever ways you can to dismantle that status quo is a whole different thing, which leaves me, I didn't feel any pressure, Dax, to distill your book into one sentence, but maybe the grad student in me, is trying to find the thesis. And I would offer up, not as the distillation of your book, but I think if someone were to point the rhetorical gun at my head and said, all right, what's the book about? Or what is the key takeaway? And I think I'm so honored to have read this and been able, I'm honored to be able to quote you to you, because I think this sentence I'm about to read is so profound and powerful and impactful. And this should be what inspires people to get involved, is the privilege of supremacy is silence.
Yeah.
Again, many other takeaways, we've already explored some of them, but I think that's the crux of what we're talking about in this admittedly brief dialogue, but it's the notion of you're privileged to not have to get involved until it shows up at your doorstep, impacts you personally, impacts someone you love.
Without a doubt. I think and I speak from that, I use that as because I've been in meetings and boardrooms where the conversation turns to these kinds of things around race. And I watch people to get quiet, just withdraw. just literally physically move backwards in their chair, right? That's somebody else's conversation to have. Or there's nothing, I have nothing to gain or lose in this conversation. I have nothing to gain and everything to lose, so I'm not going to gain, I'm not going to engage. Or I know all there is to know about this, or this conversation isn't the important conversation we need to be having right now, which I think is a common thing that I find that white men do around when race is seen as a very domestic issue. You know, I think about when, for instance, like W.E.B. Du Bois goes to the UN and he charges America with genocide. I mean, he charges the United States with genocide, and he is castigated up and down. Like, how dare you go and leave the domestic sphere? And that's the same thing that happened to King. When King decides that he wants to start to talk internationally, like, get your black butt does not talk about things outside of this country. You talk about race and you keep on that small conversation. So what I find is that white men, because they're less comfortable with the conversation, they want to keep it small and make it seem as if it is not a pervasive conversation, that it's global. That if I were to go to Europe, I'm going to see this is showing up. I'm going to go to Africa, I see it showing up. If I go to Asia, if I go to Australia, this has manifestations. All, Western civilization in this expansion of empire happened all over the globe. So why would it be the case that race is purely a United States issue, and specifically one that is only Black people's to resolve? I just feel like that's what troubles me, is that that's just privilege right happening. You just can choose to die. You can choose to turn the channel. You can choose to press, leave this conversation right now. I don't want to hear this guy Dax talking anymore. I'm not interested in this, I'm gone. And it will not feel like it's consequential to your life until it is. Right. Until it is. Until your child comes home and says, listen, I have a problem. Or until your workplace, you realize that, you know what, people aren't just going to go back to work as usual. They actually have decided that there are going to be some things that have changed around here. And that's when you have to, like, okay, now I'm scrambling. Now I need to call Dax or call somebody else to help us now. And what I'm saying is that let's not make these moves defensive moves. Let's make these moves proactive moves, and sincere and authentic moves. Because what I always want to communicate in our dwindling time as I look at the clock is that I'm not fighting for a world. I'm not struggling for a world in which we just invert the power structure, that we just get everybody who's a person of color. Now that's not what this is about. What I am trying to assert is that we have created a very problematic structure, period, that requires the exploitation of the many for the few. And that it does not matter if we just have now Black people doing that to other folks. It does not matter if we have brown folks or women or whoever else. It is the structure itself that is problematic. It is the way we have organized the thing. And yes, its genesis, its origin is in Western's expansionism and empire building, and specifically here in the United States, its origins are in chattel slavery. And we have to, not just chattel slavery, but of course the extermination and displacement and dispossession of Indian people. We have to deal with that as part of our DNA. Yeah. It is not something that we just adopted afterwards. That's how we built this thing. It's how we built this thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we're maybe America, maybe the through line of American history is that we're always at a crossroads.
Yeah, man.
I think we're at a crossroads now where, and certainly with the millennials and the younger, more engaged, warriors on our team are demanding that these injustices or no need to even go that melodramatic. That this conversation, that these facts can no longer, we will not tolerate a literal whitewashing of American history and make everyone answer the question, how are we not stronger and better as a society for embracing this, grappling with it and dealing with it and moving on as a united front? And if your answer is, well, we don't need to do that, then you've already answered the question on what side you're on.
You've already made it very clear. I mean, I'm struggling for a world that, where there's abundance that exists in this country and that events in this plan. First of all, that we are able to preserve it because we're stewards. And I like to throw in the fact that there's a climate report that came out 2 weeks ago that paints a very devastating picture of our future that we leave to everyone. So we have climate problems, we have COVID, we have obviously what's happening at the international sphere with the rise of despots. We have all these issues, and race is intertwined and interlinked in all of those. And I think that in many ways, how people who have done this work of raising their consciousness and have been inside struggles around it actually have something to say and share to all around all of these narratives, because what we've learned is that Our work has to be intersectional. We have to engage with and connect with people. We have to be willing to share power and mobilize and come to points of consensus. And we have to make compromises about things. And we can't just continue business as usual, consuming everything we want to consume, running roughshod over everybody want to roughshod. Those are lessons that we've learned from people who've been doing struggle, whether it was struggle, whether it was Chicano struggles around the farmers out, the farmers unions, or whether it was Chavez out there, or whether it was folks and Native Americans and the struggles that they were having in the 70s to really kind of reclaim their narrative. Those struggles have always learned and have come to understand that it is about people and centering the taking care of people and loving on people and holding people and recognizing that if we do that, then all of us can thrive. It doesn't have to be this competition all the time. Right. And I think we're conditioned to think that everything has to be a competition. And quite frankly, white men are the ones who I think feel like they have the most to lose right now because of that competitive mindset. When in fact, people are saying, well, just come join us. Come be part of this thing together. Yes, you won't always sit at the head of the table, but you'll be at the table because everybody, we need you at the table.
That's right. That's right.
That's what we're saying. That's what I'm saying, at least.
Yeah. Well, that is as close to a mic drop moment as we'll probably get. I will say, I always have to ask, and I want to ask. So since this book has come into the world, Dax, it doesn't have to be a positive takeaway. I hope it is. But what has changed for you or your perception, your strategy? Having written this book, knowing that it's a work in progress, but what, if anything, has changed, better, worse, etc., having put this in?
I think what I'm finding is that the book is seeping in. It's like seeping in a way. Like there are books that come out the gate or ideas that come out the gate hard. And I think I did have a little bit of a push out of the gate, but I think what I'm proud of right now is that it's just sinking in, which is what the intention was. It wasn't, and when things get to sink in, that means they can hang around for a while and they can be part of the conversation. What I'm finding again and again, and I'm surprised by and encouraged by, is that people are reading the book and reacting in a way that demonstrates they felt like they were engaged with as a friend, as somebody who cares about them and not castigated. It wasn't a self-righteous. I didn't feel like this dude was writing some self-righteous polemic because he just got to get stuff off his chest. It was like, I got something to gain here and lose here too. And so that to me has been really encouraging. And it's given me a lot of not just confidence, but a sense of calm, because I think there's always anxiety when a book like this comes out. Will I be, how will people receive it? Will people understand it? Will people give me a chance to actually speak about it, connected to it? And people like you have stepped up and given me like an audience, shared your audience with me. And I'm just like, I'm overwhelmed with gratitude, man, because you just don't know when you have these kind of conversations, whether or not which way it's going to go. And honestly, there's a lot of people who I think see the title and walk away. There are a lot of people who are like, who the hell is this guy writing this book? What does he think he has to tell me about anything? But I think by and large, I'm finding that there are people who are open to it and that they're doing their work and they come to me and they want to talk about work that they want to do. Like I've had a lot of people say like, Dax, I got an idea. I have something I want to do and I want to buy you. And that to me is like, there we go. We're not just talking about it. People are now thinking about how in my sphere of influence, in my circle in which I can have some agency, what can I do? And I find that people are really, really committing themselves to it in a way that I have not seen in my lifetime. So I want to just offer that I'm encouraged. And even though I criticize the culture of charity, I see a lot of people in that space begin to really pivot and open themselves up to feedback and engagement with folks in the community that they never had before. So there's a learning that's happening. We're in the journey. We're on the process. We just got to stay the course. Got to stay the course. Just don't get impatient. Don't get distracted. Stay the course in this work, and it might take 2 generations. I don't know, 3, but we got to stay the course.
Well, with maximum humility and utter sincerity, Dax, I want to tell you that, I'm profoundly grateful that you wrote this book. And also, I'm inspired by the fact that you also are doing the work. And I'm not just talking about for the cause, whatever that means, with a capital C, but you're doing the work for all the things we've talked about tonight. But you are, obviously and actively trying to make the world a better place. And I can't think of more noble and inspiring work that any human being can do. So you inspire me. You make me want to be a better person. You make me want to be a better storyteller. And you certainly give me courage to continue doing whatever I can to provide space and opportunities to facilitate these conversations. Because, like we said at the outset, they might not and probably should not always be comfortable, but they're typically productive and they bring people together instead of drive people apart. So I can't thank you enough. And I also definitely want to, be very clear. We've established this in our correspondence, but 1455 will always be a platform. The work you're doing is way too important to not have allies. And let's keep the dialogue going. I knew an hour wouldn't be enough. Again, I'm glad to say that an hour shouldn't be enough, but I do promise that we can and should continue to talk about this book. But for the purposes of tonight, I want to make sure people know this book's available. And if you're not sufficiently encouraged, let me further encourage you. You will learn a lot and you will be inspired to get involved. So check it out.
Thank you, man. Thank you so much. Let me get back to this little baby upstairs, man. Let me get back to D and Daddy now.
So Dax, we will end now, but I to be continued, and more work to be done, and in whatever ways we can be a forum to help get the message out. We're there. We're humble,
and I'm gonna be reading. And I'm reading your book now, man. I want everybody to know I caught my copy, of the Black and Blues. The poems is by Sean Murphy. So I just want to give you some love, man, for congratulate you for a huge accomplishment. I can't wait to dig in. I'm gonna read some poems tonight, my friend.
Right on. Well, further discussion guaranteed. So Dax, thank you for being here again. To be continued, and we'll talk to you soon. So be well, and we'll see you on the other side.
That's right, man. Have a great evening.
Thanks, all right, my friend. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.